Okay, very warm welcome. Great to have everyone joining us today for today's virtual knowledge series event, Mobilizing Circularity in Canada's Built Environment, from Concept to Best Practice, which is brought to you by Circular Economy Leadership Canada, or CELC, and CSA Group. The pleasure to have everyone joining us virtually. My name is Paul Shorthouse. I'm Managing Director at CELC, and I'll be your host for today's virtual event. Like to kick things off with an acknowledgement from the place where I call home. I'm fortunate to be here on the traditional and unceded and ancestral territories of the Coast Salish, or more specifically, the Lekwungen-speaking peoples in Victoria, BC, a land that's very rich in history and culture, and where I'm honored to be able to share in its stewardship. And I'd like to acknowledge that we have attendees joining us from the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast for today's event, as well as a few international participants. So a very warm welcome to all of you on the line. We had over 370 people register for today's event. A lot of interest from the construction and real estate industry, and we've got governments at all levels, innovators, investors, and others. So thank you very much for making the time. I welcome you to add your name and organization into the chat box if you'd like to just say hello and introduce yourself as we share a little bit of background here. So Circular Economy Leadership Canada is part of a broader family of organizations under the umbrella of the Natural Step Canada, which is a not-for-profit charity. We're focused on advancing a strong and inclusive economy that thrives within nature's limits. One of our focus areas, and we do this through sort of a multi-pronged approach, but a key focus area for us is accelerating circular economy transitions in specific sectors and resource streams that are of strategic importance to Canada. And one of those particular sectors is the construction and real estate space, which, as you know, is a focus for today's Knowledge Series webinar on applying circular strategies. Our Knowledge Series events are free and are dedicated to sharing information on topics that are relevant to circular economy transition in Canada, with the objective of increasing education and accelerating action where we can. We are honored to be co-hosting this today with our partner, with the partner organization, and I'm happy to introduce Dwayne Torrey, who's the Director of Construction and Infrastructure Standards at CSA Group, who we've been partnering with now for a few years to help explore the opportunities for circular economy strategies to be applied within the construction and built environment space. So over to you, Dwayne.
Thank you so much, Paul. And on behalf of CSA Group, I'm really pleased to welcome you all to this special event today. So as an organization dedicated to enhancing the lives of Canadians through safety, social good, and sustainability in the public and private sectors, Canadian Standards Association is pleased to be a co-host of this important conversation. Nearly all aspects in daily life are underpinned by a foundation of consensus-based standards, from the buildings Canadians live in, the hospitals that keep us healthy, the energy we rely on, and the interconnected devices we use. Now, standards offer enormous benefits. They establish a trusted, consistent benchmark for the use, safety, performance, or design of countless products, systems, and services that we encounter at home, at work, and at play. This gives Canadians peace of mind and helps drive innovation. Now, CSA standards are developed by more than 11,000 subject matter experts from a range of fields that leverage the best available information, data, and evidence to support the requirements being introduced. And the standards we create on behalf of our members provide regulators, industry, and policymakers confidence, including quality and the robustness of the content in them. So building off a strong foundation of core standards, we continue to innovate to tackle new and emerging challenges. We're actively advancing solutions for issues faced by Canadians, including climate change adaptation, advanced construction, accessibility, and low carbon construction. And the technical and management standards provide agreed upon sets of requirements, specifications, and guidelines around a given topic, and improve safety, health, the environment, and economic efficiency in Canada and beyond. Circular construction is an area that will require focus, so I am excited to help open the discussion today. With that, Paul, I'll pass it back to you.
Super, thanks, Dwayne. So this is not the start of our journey. We've been having conversations with our networks and with industry now for several years in collaboration with CSA Group and others. Really, this is building on today's session, building on sort of a roadmap of activities that we've been sort of hosting over the last couple of years. So to really set the context for today's discussion, I thought I would just start with a bit of background on this project that we're sharing today in terms of the outputs from the work we've been doing so far. So in the simplest terms, when we're thinking about the built environment and circularity within the built environment, it really involves three core elements: the adaptive reuse of existing buildings, the adaptive design of new buildings, and the reuse of materials. And these elements come together to really help future-proof the built environment, as it can help to adapt to changes in sort of business and user needs. It creates more affordable and cost-effective infrastructure when materials can stay in use for longer, and it contributes to more resilient and sustainable natural environment by helping to keep materials out of the landfill due to the need to extract fewer resources. And mobilizing circularity within the built environment has been challenging so far, especially given the current sort of linear model upon which it has evolved. And it's a model that's deeply embedded within existing industry supply chains, within construction techniques, and within sort of mindsets. So this work, and really the overall objective from this initiative, was to undertake foundational work to investigate the benefits and the value add that circular economy practices and strategies, when adopted within the construction real estate sector, could bring for Canada, including considerations around standards development as part of that process. We also had sort of a few sub-objectives for this work, which was testing with industry stakeholders the interest and appetite for developing a specific circular built environment strategy or action plan for Canada, and how that might complement existing efforts underway across sort of a range of environmental and socioeconomic priorities. In addition, we wanted to ensure that we were examining sort of the levers that support the multi-level systems change that would be required across the circular built environment value chain. So it was a multi-phased project. We had a strategic advisory committee that helped to guide this work along the way, brought together sort of a diversity of nationally focused organizations that you can see here from the logos, from some of the major industry associations representing architects, engineers, builders, and material suppliers, also for federal government departments and agencies, and several nonprofit and academic partners. And it was phased over sort of three phases over the last year and a half or so. The first was sort of a review of the current state, the gaps around policy and standards, and sort of the opportunities for addressing some of those issues or opportunity areas. And that was undertaken by SciS Advisory. And the second phase was really developing a strategic framework for action. And that was done with the support of Innovation North, and resulted in sort of a publication that you'll see kind of on the next slide. The third phase, where we're going next, is really developing an action plan and looking at mechanisms for mobilizing what comes next. So we're really presenting the outcomes from phase 1 and 2 today, and then having a bit of a discussion around phase 3 about where we go next. So just to say, these are two of the output reports that were released publicly by CSA Group, and we can drop the links to those into the chat box. So today's webinar is focused on sharing insights from the current state research in terms of circularity within Canada's built environment, the support of policies, standards, and gaps. The second objective today is to really discuss some of the big moves or the critical actions that we really need to focus on to mobilize transition within the circular built environment space in Canada. And thirdly, we would like to highlight some of the current efforts that are underway and talk a little bit more about what comes next. So in terms of the agenda, we'll start off with a couple of short presentations from the phase 1 and phase 2 authors, Helen Goodland from SciS and Tima and Liz from Innovation North. And we do welcome you to send your questions into the Q&A box as we go. We'll try to bring some of those forward. as we move through the discussions today. We'll also have a panel from industry and government to reflect on those presentations, hear a little bit of their perspectives. We've got a building developer, we've got a not-for-profit, we've got the National Research Council from the federal government and CSA Group to reflect on that. And we'll open it up for the last 15 minutes or so for some Q&A time. And so, as I mentioned as well, please put in your questions in the Q&A box as we go, and we'll try and get to some of those when we get there. So without further ado, before we kick off with the first speaker presentation, we're going to put a Zoom poll up on the screen so that we can get your quick response on this first question, which is, what do you think is the top challenge to applying more circular strategies in the construction or real estate sector? And we'll give you just 30 seconds or so to add your thoughts on this multiple choice question. We'll share back the results, and then we'll introduce our first speaker. The answers are coming in quick. Fantastic. And Kiana, if you're able to share those results back with the group. Perfect. All right, markets and infrastructure are one of the biggest issues, as well as the support of policy, and to a lesser degree, maybe the lack of awareness or knowledge. So interesting. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. We will collect these results and share that back as part of the summary. Okay, now I'm very honored and delighted to introduce Helen Goodland, who's the Principal and Head of Research and Innovation at SciAS Advisory, who led the research on the first phase of work for our CSA Group. Helen and I have worked together for about a decade now on the topic of green building, and she's an architect registered in the UK who brings over 30 years of experience working on transformative solutions in the real estate sector and the construction industry. She's based in Vancouver and who works in Canada and around the world on critical topics in this space. So Helen, over to you, and looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Paul. And hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. So yes, I'm going to be speaking about the phase one project that we worked on as part of this initiative. Paul is driving my slide, so Paul, next slide, please. I just want to sort of open my presentation by reinforcing the fact that this has been a sort of a cumulative body of research. So the report that you see at the top builds on previous efforts that have been going on for a couple of years. There is a sort of a pre-project report that was really focusing on applying circular strategies to existing office buildings that we prepared for CSA Group, which really paved the way for a lot of this research. And for those who are interested, we also summarized that work into a industry-facing guidance document that was specifically developed for Circular Economy Leadership Canada and is on their website. So our work really focuses on circular built environment strategies that take a life cycle approach. So looking at design phase, looking at the construction phase, how do we extend the life of buildings through innovative leasing, upgrades and renewals, additions and expansions, and then how do we close the loop at the end of life? Now, before I go on a little bit further and talk about where we are today, I just want to mention very quickly that both of the work, all of the projects that we worked on are very deeply technical. They're fulsome reports, and I can only cover sort of a short amount of that content today. However, if you want to paste questions in the chat for more information, my colleague Kelly Walsh is on the call as well, and she'll be able to field some of those questions, I hope, while I continue to speak. So where are we today? I think it's important to set a baseline for a current action. For sure, as that poll pointed out, there is awareness of the impacts of the construction industry on the environment. The challenge is that we're still very much at a preliminary stage of market adoption. And that challenge is really emphasized by the fact that there isn't really a lot of data on circularity in the built environment specifically. What we do know, and this is courtesy to our colleagues at Ivey Business School, is that research that they have done shows that there's really only about 6% of materials entering Canada's economy coming from recycled sources. So we know that we're really at the very beginning of our efforts, and yet there is a lot more that we can do. Construction is a very wasteful industry. There's lots of information about how much waste is heading up into landfill, but it's really only about 18%. It varies across the province. Some urban areas are doing much better than some others, but really we, again, are at a very early stage of adoption, and Canada as a country is rather behind when it comes to comparisons with other leading countries around the world. Next slide. We wanted to look very closely at the regulatory environment. Again, that Paul is absolutely spot on in pointing out that there is a challenge when it comes to policies, regulations, and the supporting sort of levers to enable industry to transform to a more circular way of building. We want to obviously look at the building codes. They inform the design and construction and renovation of buildings. And then there are local sort of regionally managed waste management bylaws that look at end of life. But really you can see that there's some gaps around the regulations around product, production, manufacture, sourcing, and there's some gaps around, the use phase and, alignment around the management of waste and end of life. Next. We also did a deep dive into standards. So as you peruse those reports, CSA reports, you'll see that there is quite a lot of discussion around the state of standards. We looked at, there are over 250 CSA standards alone related to buildings, and there are 50 other standards organizations in addition to CSA who provide standards on behalf of the building industry. We looked in detail at about 55 standards and their applicability to the building industry. And you'll see that there is a range of challenges that we'll discuss in 2 seconds. Next. So when it comes to the sort of technical standards, the technical issues related to the adoption of circularity in the building industry, there are challenges really around everything from the use of non-standard materials. There are design standard challenges, there are construction standard challenges, mostly to do with the fact that there are gaps and inconsistencies, and the standards don't necessarily all talk to each other in a consistent way. There are also, as I said, lack of data, but specifically lack of consistent metrics and indicators. So for example, the way that each province, region, territory measures and manages waste in the construction sector is different. So different materials are included in total numbers, materials are handled differently, they're calculated differently. There are different levels of government, lack of alignment, so federal, provincial, regional, local. And I think, again, this survey mentioned that there are market barriers, there's insufficient markets for used materials, there's insufficient volumes of materials managed and organized in a consistent way to encourage the building industry to confidently be able to procure and specify those materials. When it comes to standards gaps, I think really we have only really scraped the sort of surface of that, and there are going to be a lot more deeper dives into that space as we progress further into this field. Next. So this is a 150-page report that is now distilled into sort of a few slides, but essentially the recommendations, next slide, please, Paul, really fall into 5 key areas. Recommendation number 1 is that we really need some common language about how we talk about circularity in the building industry. I mean, just as a very basic example, the words for renovation, retrofit, renewal, revitalization, refurbishment, alteration, all of those words tend to be used interchangeably, and yet they can mean very different things. So, and that's a very simple example. Obviously, as we get into standards definitions and things, we really need to be very clear about what we're talking about and what terminology we use. And we also need to set a timeline for how we implement those criteria within standards. Just another example around how language can be used more effectively in standards. What we found in our review was that there's a lot of standards that are quite silent on the applicability of materials in subsequent life phases. So, even just the basic standards around, designing with wood, designing with concrete, designing with steel, we need to make sure that we don't explicitly stay quiet on the potential for those materials in their future lives, and that the standards need to be able to explicitly embrace that and articulate what those future life performance criteria might be. Another area where we need to look at, more work needs to be done, and that's around the data-driven activities. So that's everything from the increased use of technology, use of systems like building information modeling. Those models can be extremely rich in the way that they handle handle data, and that data can be used for decision making. So using BIM, shifting to more prefabricated industrialized construction methods, and then tracking the performance of those buildings over their lifespan. So, concepts such as building material passports can help really aggregate information on a life cycle basis for buildings, so that at renovation stages, a lot more information is available about what is in that building and what needs to be done to look after it properly. There's also a focus on renovations and resilience. As Paul said at the beginning, we really need to focus on maintaining our existing building stock and extending the life phases. So considering a sort of renovation first approach to policies, would be a really good way to start. And of course, we know that there is a model national retrofit code in the works, which is going to help enable some of that. We also need to develop a circular built environment strategic framework, and that really is a way to sort of organize next steps. Paul's going to talk a little bit more about that as part of this session, and I think that Circular Economy Leadership Canada has some plans afoot to be able to sort of move that forward. But that's everything from looking at permitting incentives, how and where recycling centers need to be set up to stimulate some of those markets for recycled materials. We need to have an advocacy position on ensuring that all of the housing, low-rise housing that's being demolished to build more densified housing projects, that those materials don't get lost and landfilled in the process. That's a big push to resolve the housing crisis right now. And then finally, we obviously need to educate and educate and educate to build knowledge, build awareness, and provide the technical tools for industry to be able to implement some of these solutions. Next. So to get started, we suggest some big moves. So these are potentially the topics for further discussion today. That national waste management framework, where we can bring together all of the different waste management authorities across the country to align definitions and metrics. We need to think about and leverage the emerging interest in embodied carbon requirements. A number of cities and communities have embedded these reporting requirements into codes and policies, and there is going to be an embodied carbon requirement in the forthcoming national building codes through to the end of this decade. We also need to incorporate circularity measures into design standards for key structural materials. I mentioned the fact that they're currently silent. They don't prohibit, but they really need to more proactively embrace circularity criteria for steel, concrete, wood, masonry, structural materials would be a good place to start, and then proliferate over time into other materials. The certification of salvage materials, we heard through our various research processes, is one of the major barriers to using reclaimed materials in new projects. That certification process needs to be resolved and simplified. And then we need a pan-national network of markets for reused materials that are coordinated with each other so that we can build volumes and scale up sufficient for the industry to be confident to use them. Canada lacks a national BIM mandate. We have guidelines, but we do need to have a national mandate to facilitate project data management and reporting. There is a discussion about implementing an ISO 19650 Canadian annex, and I think CSA may be able to answer some more questions about where that's at shortly, but that's a really positive first step, but in the absence of a national mandate. And finally, we would recommend that there are net zero policy roadmaps being rolled out right across the country in pretty much every community, large and small. It would be really good to extend those policies to cover waste and resource efficiency. So Paul, I think that's it in a sort of whirlwind tour of the work that we've done. Obviously, there is a lot more rich data in the reports that you'll find on the CSA website through the links in the chat. But I'm really delighted to answer any questions if I can right now. And if not, I'll pass it back to Paul.
Thank you, Helen. You did cover an enormous amount of content in a very short period. Appreciate you keeping it succinct. Here's your email, I guess, if people would like to reach out, but also the link's been shared in terms of the summary report, the landscape analysis report that was put together as part of phase 1. So thanks very much, Helen, for providing that overview. Maybe what we'll do is take a question, and while that question is being taken out of the Q&A chat box, we're going to do a quick second poll, Zoom poll for the audience here, and we'll bring this up here just momentarily. The question is, rank the following big moves presented by SciS, by Helen here. What do you think are some of the most important aspects here? Is there some that you would prioritize over others? And you can do that by clicking on if you scroll over anyway, it gives you a chance to click on not important, somewhat important, very important, and you can do a quick ranking opportunity here. While you're doing that, the question I have for you, Helen, is a question around the state of the current industry and the statistics you shared about waste in the construction and demolition space. The question was, did the stats you shared include materials from construction only, or did it also include the demolition side as well?
So we took that from a national number where it depends on the province. They've accumulated both. So in some cases, the provinces include demolition waste and some they don't. So it's not the right answer that you're looking for, but that speaks to the lack of data that we have across the country.
Perfect, thank you. Any other questions that come into the Q&A box? Helen, maybe just keep an eye on that and you can respond in real time via the chat. Kiana, if you're able to share the results of the latest poll. Fantastic. You see a bit of a sliding scale here where the orange are the very important bar, the blue being somewhat important, the lighter blue being less important, or least important. So what's coming out on the top is the need for criteria for design standards and structural materials, and more to support the use of salvage materials, whether that's testing, certification, etc., as two of the top areas for big moves. Thank you, Helen. That's great. We'll capture this as well and share that back. I'm happy now to introduce our next set of speakers, Tima Bansal, as the Canada Research Chair in Business Sustainability and a professor at Ivey School of Business. She's been researching, teaching, and collaborating around the topic of business and sustainability for over 30 years. And in 2022, she chaired the CCA's expert panel on the circular economy, which produced the Turning Point report that some of you may be familiar with. It describes the state of practice around circularity in Canada. So delighted that she was able to work on phase 2 of this project with CSA Group and ourselves. And then Liz is a postdoctoral associate at Innovation North as well with the Ivey School of Business. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Tima and Liz, who will walk through the next phase of work that was done.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul. And I have to say, what a thrill to have so many people show up on this webinar. It just goes to show how important this topic is and how much we all care. So I am going to start sharing my screen, and I'm assuming that's all working as I hoped. I'm going to start with where Helen ended. And this is where she ended, was on the suggested big moves. In a nutshell, what we wanted to do in this phase 2 of the report, phase 2 of the studies, I guess, is to say, how do we discriminate across these big moves? How do we actually get there, given that this is a huge systems change and there's so many actors and activities that have to change? And so we know that these are really big moves. Okay, so just a reminder about where we are in our activity set. We're at phase 2, which was the strategic framework for future action. It's not the action plan, that is yet to come. So we're all looking forward to that. We had 25 interviews with 30 informants, 3 virtual workshops, and what I'm sure many of you who are at the webinar here have been consulted by us, and we had an in-person workshop in Ottawa. We know the linear economy. I don't want to spend any time with that, and this is a circular economy. What I wanted to demonstrate here is that there's 3 aspects that Paul mentioned right at the outset that we're focusing on. We're focusing on building reuse, adaptive design of new buildings, and the material reuse in other buildings. So that's our focus. There is, I think, a couple of really important points that we're trying to make in this report. That is the sequencing of activities that will move us towards systems change, so strategic framework. And the second one is so the categorization and the sequencing. So how do we tell which activities we engage in first and with whom? So as we start to do our work, we recognize that, of course, this is a systems problem, the circular built environment. And this is partly why it's so hard to change, because everything has to change. So we have to know what to do first and with whom. We recognize as we were doing our work is that there's 2 groups of actors. The central and direct actors is one group. They're the ones that actually build the built environment. So there'd be the architects, the engineers, the builders, the deconstruction, demolition, salvage companies, and the owners and developers. So they're going to make the circular built environment happen. But the enabling actors are important as well. And in fact, arguably more important in making the built environment happen. So if we talk about the top 2 groups being the ones that act, the enabling actors enable the top actors to act. And that becomes very important. So that we know we need a circular built environment. How do we get there? So I'm going to argue is that there's 3 phases that we have to move to in the transition. The first, and this is the counterintuitive piece, is that the enabling actors actually have to lift the frictions. And Liz is going to tell you more about them in a few moments, but they're the ones that help understand or help to change some of the standards, to educate. So they can actually allow the direct actors then to build a better built environment. And just pulling off of what Helen said and what we did, that one of the earlier polls, these preconditions are actually the ones that prevent the circular built environment from working. So if you notice the gaps and challenges that Helen mentioned, a lot of them is not about making the built environment happen. It's about lifting some of the frictions. It's about lifting some of the market barriers. It's about standards gaps. It's about the lack of data. So you can see this lack of things that allow the direct actors to act. And even our first poll, once again, lack of risk. So those are the things that we have to do first in order to make the built environment work. The second thing that we need to do is to transition is the direct actors have to advance the built environment. And so those are the actual project activities. As soon as you lift 1 or 2 frictions, we can enable some of the project activities to move forward. And then once we enable some of those new projects, so those pilots possibly, then we can learn from them. We can celebrate the wins. We can share the learnings. And that motivates more enabling actors to lift the frictions. So you can imagine then this spiraling circle. And what we'll see is at the beginning, we have a few actions that are taken, a few people who are involved in the circular environment. We move on the preconditions, have project activities, have post activities, engage more people, have more of the built environment circular. And as we move more and more towards creating a transition to a circular built environment. I'm going to hand off now to Liz, and she's going to explain to us where we can start with some of those preconditions.
Thank you, Tima. We found in our research that there's a great deal of energy in this space, but not a lot of clarity about where to begin, which we hope that these two reports will help remedy. And so we identified 4 key areas to start with in the preconditions phase. The first is that we found a strong need to build awareness. We heard in our research that the concept of CBE is still quite unfamiliar to many players in the space, and there's not even consensus really about what CBE actually means, more tangibly. And so one starting point could be, for example, an NGO such as CELC partnering up with industry associations to educate owners and developers about what CBE is and how to ask for it in their projects. The second area that we identified in the preconditions is building physical viability. Some circular solutions, like reusing salvaged material for structural applications, currently lack the standard certifications and supply chains that would be needed to implement. So, you've heard about this already from Helen a bit. And one action in this space could be, for example, conducting research on how to safely use reclaimed materials and then identifying how to develop standards and certifications around that. Third is building financial viability. In some cases, circular building projects can be prohibitively expensive, so there's a need to innovate new forms of financing. And finally, we need to build coalitions. We know that no single actor can make the transition in the built environment alone. And so action in this space can look like mobilizing a coalition of the willing, which we found in our research is probably a much bigger group than it might seem. Interestingly, even in some of our conversations with more mainstream developers, there was a lot of interest in this topic, but they use different language. So thinking about future-proofing their assets, for example, rather than circularity. And so to sum up what we put together in this report, so as we heard, we identified 3 categories of actions that move through these 3 different phases of establishing the preconditions, so lifting frictions like we've been talking about, executing project activities, and then learning from those activities. And, we can start with those 4 areas of preconditions that I just outlined. And we also just want to stress that, the circle can be continually expanded if we potentially think about using more accessible and resonant language than the term circularity. And we also just wanted to stress too that there's a lot of action already happening in this space, as you'll hear about shortly in the panel. And as we continue to move through these cycles of preconditions, project activities, and learning about the wins, we can continue to grow out the circle to make the transition happen. Thank you.
And if I might just add then, one of our important recommendations in this report is that we need to get to the big moves, but we need to start with the small moves first, and every small move makes an incremental step in the direction that we want to go. There's our email addresses. I'm at the top, Liz at the second. Carly also contributed considerably to this report, and Jess helped keep us on time and on track.
And you've done very well at keeping on time here as well. So thank you for that overview. And again, it's a very action-oriented framework. It's not the action plan per se. Thanks for clarifying that. But it will be, I think, a very good guiding document for us as an industry stakeholder and others to follow. And thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. I might just ask the audience, as you're thinking of questions or you have questions, to please put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box, because that will allow us to answer those directly. And we will save some time for Q&A. Maybe just one question. There was a comment in the chat about whether or not what the timeline is for the action plan. So that is something that we're looking to advance with partners over the next 6 months as we build out from the phase 1 and phase 2 work. But Liz, I know you and team had been looking at some very specific actions that could be linked to different stakeholders as sort of next steps as well. Do you want to share just quickly where that's at?
Yeah, so we've been in the process of trying to visualize all of these actions that we've identified in the report. So we have specific actions laid out in the report, but we wanted to put together some sort of visualizing document. So we've been working very hard with CSA, the CSA team, and the CSA designer to put together a graphic that resonates. So please stay tuned for that.
Perfect. Thank you. I will introduce our panel now, but invite you to have a look at the Q&A box and maybe respond to a few of the questions that have come in as we go. Terrific. So thanks again. Great to have that overview of those first two phases of work. And now I'd like to introduce our panel who are joining us from both industry and government perspectives to reflect a little bit on what they've heard from Helen and Innovation North's presentations. We've got Gil Yaron, who's Managing Director of Circular Innovation at Lighthouse, which is a Vancouver-based not-for-profit. He's been working in this space for 30 years or so in terms of green building, waste management, extended producer responsibility, product development. So glad to have Gil joining us. We have Leila Mahdi, who is a sustainability consultant and research officer at the National Research Council, who's focused on construction, sustainability management, life cycle assessment, and circular economy practices. We also have Robert Rayner, who oversees the implementation of portfolio-wide decarbonization and circularity practices at TAS, which is a Toronto-based real estate developer. And he's been working on identifying the sort of levers that developers hold to shape a net zero world and each stage of sort of the development process. And then Ivica, who is Strategic Initiatives Manager for Construction and Infrastructure at CSA Group, where he has been focused on climate resiliency, decarbonization, and circular economy standards and initiatives. And previous to his time with CSA Group, Ivica worked with the European Commission and the European Cement Association. So invite our panelists to turn on their cameras and join us on this the virtual stage here. And we'll open it up to a bit of a panel discussion. So I will stop sharing my screen here, and that way we can see everyone's pretty faces. Perfect. Why don't we just kick things off with a bit of a reflection and really quickly go around, starting with you, Gil. In 2 minutes or less, tell us a little bit more about your organization and how what you heard here in terms of circularity practices, et cetera, how is that showing up within your sort of day-to-day efforts and activities? Oh, and you're on mute.
I never seem to learn that lesson. Thanks, Paul, for inviting me to participate in this discussion, and to welcome to everyone who's on the call today. Lighthouse is a non-for-profit organization, I think Paul mentioned. Our focus is on accelerating circular policy and practices in the built environment. And I think that the focus for us is really building multi-stakeholder projects that are trying to action many of the elements that were identified in Helen's presentation around big moves at primarily at a local level. I wanted to stress, like in all of these instances, it requires a partnership. It requires many different players to be engaged to move any of these areas forward. And so we really are focusing on bringing different stakeholders together from industry and government to affect what we see here. Some of the examples of the work that we're doing is we've created a building material exchange program on Vancouver Island with the support of 3 regional districts, industry associations like the Vancouver Island Construction Association, other nonprofits like Synergy Foundation, really bringing a collective together, to a consortium of organizations together to make this happen. And so that project's underway on the island. Another example is supporting the work of Renewal Development, which is a company based in Vancouver that is developed a program for relocating and retrofitting the more than 3,000 homes that are scheduled for demolition, as Helen mentioned, in the push to densify, trying to capture and save some of these homes and relocate them to First Nations communities and nonprofit housing associations in rural areas, both to preserve the embodied carbon, and I'll get kind of back to kind of the wins that we can see as a result of these kinds of projects, but also to provide affordable housing. And then developing a pilot program. One of the things I'm excited about is developing a pilot program to capture plastics that are being generated on construction sites and diverting them and recycling them essentially, or reusing them and creating building products out of them. So trying to really create a circular closed loop for these types of materials, which plastics in particular seem to have gone unnoticed thus far in this conversation, but it's an important category of materials. I'll leave it there.
We're doing a lot, and great to hear some of those impactful projects and initiatives underway. Robert, maybe we can turn to you. Tell us a little bit more about TAS and where the work is showing up in your day-to-day.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Paul. And yeah, thanks everyone for having me. I'm a net zero coordinator at TAS, so a residential housing developer in Toronto. We also have a light industrial portfolio too. And a project that we're working on right now is at 2 Tecumseh Street, so King and Bathurst area for folks who are familiar with the Toronto area. And it's on the site of a former abattoir, or it's a less commonly known word, slaughterhouse, next to a former garbage incinerator and a former coffin factory. It used to be the edge of the city of Toronto, so they kind of shoved all the things people don't necessarily want to see out to that side. And now it's basically in the heart of the city, surrounded by housing. These 3 industrial uses no longer make sense in this region. In this part of the city, the Wellington Destructor was closed about 50 years ago and has sat vacant since then. The slaughterhouse was shuttered about 10 years ago. And we're building a 1,200 unit housing complex with a massive sort of outdoor public realm and retail, and it's a large mixed use community. And in the process of demolishing the slaughterhouse to kind of make way for this new project, we managed to basically take 2/3 of the demolition waste, so about 20,000 tons of demolition waste, and rather than just sending them to recycling centers, we actually keep them within the boundary of the site. We're not letting 2/3 of the demolition waste from the existing building leave the site, and we're reintegrating it into the landscape of the new project. So the office is primarily run by former architects, so there's always kind of the mindset of, how do you bring a lot of these larger visions and ideals into development. We work with a lot of partners to make that happen. That project's underway.
Super interesting. I would like to unpack that a bit further in terms of the business case, et cetera. So we'll come back to that, but
For sure.
Let's go to Layla next to say hello and a quick overview of NRC and how this is showing up in your work.
Thanks, Paul. Hello, everybody. I'm so pleased I'm here today. Regarding your question, about NRC, National Research Council Canada is the primary agency of Government of Canada in science and technology research and development. And it's the core role of NRC within Canada's innovation, technology, and science is business innovation, policy solutions for government, and advancing knowledge. NRC is, collaborates with innovation, science, and economic development, ISED, and other partners of government, academia, and businesses to develop new research ideas and actually contribute to the economic growth and innovation. And also IRAP, Industrial Research Assistant Program, that is one of the leading grant programs of Canada, is one of the critical components of the NRC that plays important role regarding support the small and mid-size businesses. That is one of the missions of NRC. Regarding, because NRC has different 5 R&D divisions, that engineering is one of them, and there is about the construction research center is under engineering division, that the expertise in this research center spans in different areas such as infrastructure and civil engineering, building envelope and materials, sustainability management, building information management, life cycle assessment, carbon accounting, and fire safety. But in terms of circular economy, actually, it's our goals in NRC. As I mentioned, the core role is, business innovation and actually advancing knowledge. It's completely aligned with the goals to the to support the government of sustainability development and actually enforcing, I mean, a sustainable and resilient built environment. Also, I mean, reduction of the carbon emissions target. Because of that, we have several programs. I can mention to the climate resilience building and core public infrastructure program from 2016 and the CRB, that's client resilient built environment, that's recently initiated, and other programs, and recently National Platform for Decarbonize the Construction Research Center, construction sector. It's some examples of the efforts that NRC is actively involved to provide low carbon solutions and actually for the construction and find the solutions performance based and develop the codes and support the guidelines. For example, one of the National Building Code that the last edition was 2020, and for now NRC is actively working to develop to enter the low carbon requirements and carbon accounting requirements to the codes. That all of this, and also life LCA score that I mentioned, that developing the inventory, life cycle inventory for the construction sector is some of the examples that NRC is doing fundamental works to support the transition into the circular built environment. And this kind of adoption of, for example, low carbon requirements to the codes, it would be, one of the steps that we can move forward in the future to add circularity requirements as well. And just, a quick mention that regarding the decarbonization of the construction sector and the national platform, that different challenge programs that all the goals are, developing the low carbon solutions and digitization of the construction process, that it's important as a transparency for the circular supply chain. It's some of the efforts that it's aligned with the transition toward the circular built environment.
Thank you, Leila. It's good to hear about how you're seeing the connection with the embodied carbon and the LCA work into codes, and how that might expand to consider circularity practices in the future. And I'm sure the work that's been done by Helen and others to support sort of the gap in policy and codes will be helpful as you're thinking about some of this. Ivica, would you like to say a quick hello and tell us a little bit more about the specific linkage here that you're working on?
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul, and thank you everyone, especially to our presenters, but also to panel experts here. It's my pleasure to be with you today. So briefly, I will mention that CSA's journey to support circularity in the built environment began really close to 30 years ago. In 1995, we published the first Canadian guideline on durability in buildings. And since then, we've published several other standards and guidelines, such as design for disassembly and adaptability in buildings, deconstruction of buildings, and then also accountable management of end-of-life materials. Also, pretty proud to say that our circular standards have also had international impact, in the sense that the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, used the CSA guideline on design for disassembly as a foundational document, based on which it developed the first international standards that published in 2020. Then again, in our day-to-day life, we have been working closely with the industry, but also the federal government, several departments, and have supported national initiatives, such as Leila mentioned, National Research Council's platform to decarbonize the construction sector at scale, but also several others, such as the Environment and Climate Change Canada's efforts to diverge from landfills, basically the construction demolition waste coming from the wood industry, and then use them back in construction when possible. There's also the Natural Resources Canada's bioeconomy strategy that we have been supporting, through some important CSA solutions, and then also the Treasury Board greening government strategy. So when you think about all these federal government strategies, topics that we've been addressing really range from considering where, for example, prescriptive requirements can turn more into performance-based standards, which will actually allow for innovation for more low-carbon materials, among others. But then also things like modular construction practices and digital solutions, including building information modeling. And really, finally, when you look at the product level, CSA's technical committees have embedded circular solutions in some of the CSA standards, so some foundational moves have certainly happened. So one such example I can highlight is really this industrial symbiosis between the cement and steel industry, where basically byproducts from steel manufacturing, which is blast furnace slag, is used as a strength enhancing compound for the cement and concrete industry. So this replaces the need for raw materials and also reduces greenhouse gas emissions, which is certainly circular practice. So yeah, I'll stop here and then we can delve into more details.
That's great. Thanks, Ivica. And just coming back from a CSA Group event in Vancouver last week, I was very impressed by the breadth and depth of the work that's happening in the construction infrastructure space, more specifically as it relates to circularity. So thanks for sharing that. Robert, I want to come back to the point you raised earlier, and as was flagged by Tima and Liz in their document and their presentation, developers as well as building owners or asset owners were identified as, really one of the most important decision makers for advancing circular economy practices within the built environment. What do you think, as a sort of a developer, we need to be doing to mainstream circular economy thinking with developers, in terms of driving this activity within sort of real estate portfolios or projects or investments?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, I think this is to their point, like a very critical component of ensuring that circularity is something that is built into every new building. At TAS so far, it was broken down earlier in the presentations that we're kind of talking about adaptive design of new buildings, adapting existing buildings for new uses, and reusing materials from buildings that couldn't have either of those things happen. And right now, the third one kind of applies to the work that we're doing. What made this project possible for us was a couple of things. Firstly, we had a large brick and concrete structure that could not be repurposed for something else. It was a slaughterhouse is a very, very specific sort of building typology, a lot of funny levels, a lot of funny kind of connections, and we wouldn't necessarily have been able to put more than a few kind of oddly sized housing units into it as it already was. Also, some of the structure was about 100 years old, parts of it were kind of crumbling, and it became something where we knew we couldn't adaptively reuse it, so we had to go to reusing materials as best as we could. The second thing that made it possible was we had space to store the materials. So it's a 7-acre site phased into 2 parts. And so we were able to store all of the material that came down with the slaughterhouse, 20,000 tons of bricks, concrete, wood, metal, store that on the phase 2 lands. And so as we build phase 1 and landscape phase 1, that material goes into the landscape of phase 1. And so really having that space directly next to the site made that feasible. And thirdly, we work with a really great firm, Priestley Demolition, and we explained to them kind of the process, what we were looking for, and they were able to really go through and kind of meticulously figure out how to dismantle things in a way where they could bring out large concrete elements like bricks in a neater capacity than may otherwise have been done, and store those and kind of deal with the material in that way. We wanted to do it because there's a sustainability benefit, to Leila's point, like embodied carbon is something we measure on all of our projects and are actively looking to kind of reduce the carbon footprint of these things, and not having to take material, put it in trucks, take it over to landfill, your C and your D phases of embodied carbon analysis, bringing new material, procuring that new material, firing bricks in a kiln, all of the things in the A material to bring them back onto the site again, being able to reuse things in situ really reduces that amount. And there's also a cultural benefit, where this was a site that had a lot of things happen to it in the past. This was a site where there was a slaughterhouse, and for better or worse, there's a history there that to completely eradicate and say never happened was something we didn't necessarily we didn't think it was fair and fitting to do. So we worked with our landscape architects to say, you know, how can we kind of bring the cultural element? They actually brought the idea to us of, you know, we want to include this cultural element in. We understood the sustainability benefits and kind of drove to push it further. But what was challenging was that it was landscape only. And for us, that was primarily due to risk and perceived risk. So understanding that if we try and reuse some of this material in the building itself, a lot of the material being like a concrete structure, we're crushing things. Bricks, you can kind of only use to a certain extent in the build materials that come out of an existing building in a building that's 10, 15, 20 times the size. And so for us, a lot of that kind of goes into finishes and things in the podium itself. It wasn't a steel structure, so we weren't able to reuse steel in the same way that we necessarily could have. And we were only using materials from our own site. You know, we weren't necessarily trying to actively procure materials from other sites because this was the first time that TAS was undertaking this work. So the risk of some of those things, or what seemed to be a perception of that risk, was a concern. The other was additional cost. And so this was a fear that, you know, it would just cost more money and labor to dismantle things very cleanly. But for us, the benefit was we could improve the public realm, and that kind of comes with a major improvement to the livability of the space. And there's sort of a story that we wanted to tell, we knew was altruistically important. And we could also save on trucks going back and forth by doing a lot of the work right on site. And so that ended up kind of bringing the cost down closer to cost parity. So for this to happen on all of our sites, the main things that we're looking at are, you know, incentives, being able to tie that into whether it's Toronto Green Standard or Canada Green Building Council Zero Carbon Building Standard, some of these things that we use to get preferential financing, development charge rebates, the things that we use and put into our pro forma to kind of say to our investors, the thing that we're doing here is not an additional cost. This is something that's necessary and something that will help with the return that is allowing us to do the project in the first place. That's an important piece. Secondly, would be material salvage depots. So we have our own little site where we're doing some of this work. We're actually bringing material from other sites to this site as well. And that's kind of helping us with the demolition of a couple of other projects in the city. But being able to really bring material from those sites is a major one. And insurance. So having kind of like a warranty for used materials and being able to really say, okay, we know that if we do integrate this into the structure in the next project or even finishes in the next project, that there's the same sort of lack of risk that we would otherwise have with those new materials. Beyond price parity, those are the three main things.
Super interesting, and it's good to see the thinking that has gone into this project and the learnings that have come out of it at the same time, but really being able to articulate that value proposition for different perspectives in that value chain seems to be what's been helpful for you guys to move that project forward. Maybe I'll ask Gil, as a sort of a not-for-profit that's working in the construction circular economy space. One of the things that I know, Gil, you guys have been trying to think through is how do you make that value proposition align with different industry priorities like affordable housing or climate resilience, et cetera. Can you give us any examples of where you're seeing those opportunities to bring circularity closer to existing industry priorities and goals?
Yeah, and I just want to preface it by saying I think making the case today is becoming increasingly easier, if I could use that word, just because of the market dynamics. You know, the rising costs of material and labor, and the other kind of the crises that we're facing around housing and waste. So the whole dynamic, or the whole economic framework is shifting, and I think it's providing a more compelling argument for transitioning to more circular models of doing things. And so one of the examples I mentioned earlier is Renewal Development, this company that has created a home relocation and repurposing program, which is taking existing homes and relocating them, retrofitting them and relocating them to First Nations and nonprofit housing associations. This, the really compelling piece of this project is, and really is what has won it so much support, is the fact that it's creating affordable housing. The cost to move and retrofit a home is estimated to be about 30% or more less expensive than building new, depending on where the home is, being relocated and various other factors. The saving and preservation of embodied carbon and maintaining the home in its highest and best use, as opposed to even deconstruction, where or worse, where you're downcycling the materials. And the keeping material out of landfill, so reducing the impact on our solid waste infrastructure. So, a program like that kind of hits all the markers and really is just an exciting project. Another example that we've come upon through our building material exchange program, one of the Habitat for Humanities on Vancouver Island is looking at incorporating salvage material into their new housing projects. So, they as a developer have control over these projects, and they can, incorporate these types of materials and these design options into their projects. And again, it achieves all of these objectives of preserving embodied carbon, waste mitigation, and also obviously supporting affordable housing in the sense that that's Habitat's primary mandate. So yeah, just a couple of examples, I think, where we see the intersection of the projects that we're working on.
If there's case studies or reports, feel free to share those in the chat box in terms of the outcomes from some of those projects, and I'm sure people will be interested.
Yeah, actually, thanks. If I could just quickly, we did do a comparative life cycle assessment on the one of the relocations that were done by Renewal Development, and that is available publicly on our website. So I will put that in the chat.
Perfect. Maybe we'll go to a few questions from the Q&A box. I know a few have been answered in real time already, so thanks to Helen, team, and others who've been answering those on the fly. A question, though, around standards. And it's a question about whether a set of indicators or sort of a taxonomy which form, standards could contribute to circularity in the built environment. So has we developed a set of indicators or a taxonomy where standards would support circularity within the built environment? I think it's essentially a question around how can standards be mapped to the different circularity practices and strategies. Ivica, do you want to tackle that one?
Absolutely, yeah. I may just start to mention that actually ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, just published the first international circular economy standards, and they do cover some of these, I think, these questions. So one of them is the terminology and definitions of what circular economy actually means and what it is. Then also guidance to businesses on how to transition toward circular business models, and also the ways to measure and assess circular performance based on standard indicators. So we, CSA has managed on behalf of the Standards Council of Canada, the Canadian Mirror Committee to this ISO technical committee. So we will be adopting these standards into Canada soon in the coming months. And our next step will be to look at these standards to see their applicability to the built environment. I do believe that ISO is kind of, going in the same direction. And I think also European counterparts, CELC, they're also doing the same thing, kind of looking at a more sector-specific application of these international standards. So our role and our contribution will be to actually look at this, provide Canadian contribution to see what indicators, what performances and measures make sense in that sense. And also, so that's from the kind of this framework perspective. And from the perspective of existing CSA standards, what we can do is to look more broadly into alignment of our existing standards to allow for circularity, something that Helen mentioned during her presentation, so that, for example, the end of life of products doesn't mean that it's wasted, but it's actually end of first life, looking around performance criteria for reuse materials, products, and components, and build them back into the construction cycle.
Thank you. There's one more question, which I think I'll answer quickly, and it's a question around whether anyone in Canada is currently building housing using reclaimed materials in a systemized way. and rather than one-off sort of high-end customized projects or buildings. And I'd say that while it's not mainstream yet, there are processes and prefabricated builders and others that are looking at how to integrate more recycled content or materials into those projects. But I think it gets back to one of those earlier comments around the risk of getting access to materials that can perform like virgin materials or like new materials, and at a reasonable quantity and quality and cost that we can rely on. And I think that's the next thing we need to focus on in terms of tackling, to be able to use those materials in a more mainstream way here in Canada. I'm conscious of time. I want to save just a few minutes for wrap up from our side, but if we could just do a quick roundtable on the with the panel here to wrap up in terms of what you think is the most pressing action we need to prioritize to advance circular practices within the construction sector. What's the most important thing you think we need to drive home with participants today as a takeaway from today's session? I'm going to give you each 30 seconds to answer that question, and maybe I'll go in reverse order. So back to you, Vita, then Leila.
Certainly, Paul. So it is a systems problem, and we will not solve the world only by providing standards. But if we tackle standards only, in the wider spectrum of things, certainly one thing that comes up is around terminology and definitions for circularity in the built environment, providing that, and also understanding that I believe the circular economy is really a means to an end. So whether we look at from the perspective of decarbonization, housing prices, productivity, waste, or other perspectives, we can certainly find ways to find solutions based on circular practices.
Thanks, Vita. Leila?
Yes, just as the point, I would like to add that there is as Isa mentioned about the standards, but there is I believe that in order to accelerating the transition, we need the in parallel effort for in tackling with the barriers and actually going to move forward with the actions. It's the time that we work on, for example, adaptive design for new buildings to avoid that adding more construction based on a linear approach. And actually in parallel with that, we need to work on the standards and also the policy integration in the local, provincial, and federal level to have a consistency to support our transition to to advance actually our move to the circular built environment. So because of that, and also in parallel, also there is a need to work on the viability research. That's important to see that to clarify that what's the benefits of moving to the circularity, what's the benefit to the nature, to the biodiversity, and actually what's the benefits for the stakeholders, and to have better understanding about this approach. So it's the things that I see we need to work on it's not just economic approach, it's economic, environmental, and social approach, and it needs the effort from the multiple levels of the businesses, the governmental level, and also the communities share on that.
Thank you. Robert?
Yeah, I would definitely expand on that answer. I think it's great. And it's interesting, my background is in architecture and working in development right now. I'm kind of seeing where there are certain levers that only developers are able to pull in service of kind of furthering some of these things, having access to space to store materials for staging, owning those materials already, or being able to kind of buy and sell those materials with other groups. And so I think it's a slightly different answer depending on whether you're talking to a for-profit developer, a not-for-profit developer, or like a government organization who builds buildings as well, who develops their own projects. And certainly with those groups, I think having some of the infrastructure backing, having spaces to store materials, and I know the city of Toronto is working on some potential locations to kind of store materials for larger projects. Having a means of buying and selling material, or kind of moving between different groups as a marketplace. That's something that's kind of a broader industry thing. But certainly for developers and definitely for in the for-profit sector, kind of building a lot of the housing that has to be built in this country, you know, we have to build many more homes and also pollute less than we're already polluting. And so being able to have these ways of ensuring that the main factors that drive development, which is I mean primarily risk, is really the kind of the number one thing. If it's perceived that, oh, you can't afford to do this for monetary reasons, or you can't afford to do this because the insurance risk is just too high, or the construction timeline risk is too long, these are very easy ways that this sort of whole process can be pushed to the side. So having kind of proof of concept that may come from more municipal levels or groups where those risks are like fewer, or they're able to kind of move past them more quickly without having to kind of turn to the investment side and try to prove the model. And then also having kind of in tandem with that, really just having a space where you can store materials and a space where you're able to kind of do that transferring of things is really kind of key for us.
We're bumping up against time. I think we could have had another hour here for this discussion. I really appreciate everyone's thoughts. Gil, 20 seconds, and then we're going to wrap.
I'll take 10. Just saying, you know, I really echo Avicha's comments around, you know, it's a systems problem and all this things that the other panelists have shared. I would really prioritize, though, government leadership on this around both policy and procurement. It will drive, we need demand to drive market change.
Well, thank you very much to the panel for sharing your thoughts and giving those really real world examples of what's happening right now across Canada and where you think we need to go next. I will allow you to drop off, and I'm just going to wrap up quickly here to say, in terms of our next steps, we're going to continue engaging with the construction real estate sector. We're going to continue to advance some of the priorities that were outlined in that strategic framework that was presented today, and work on developing an action plan with all the stakeholders here, and looking for others to come together to partner with us. We would really like to develop a vehicle for launching and continuing the work in this space. And so we're looking at launching what we're calling a circular construction innovation hub, a hub and spoke model that would be for helping to coordinate and share information and knowledge and support projects and pilots on the ground across different work streams with steering committee and working groups to help drive some of this forward. So if you're interested in learning more about the idea of this construction innovation hub as sort of a next step, love you to reach out to me and we can share more. But just wanted to say on behalf of CELC and CSA Group today, big thank you to our speakers, our panel, and also everyone here for sticking around till the very end. We'll be sure to share this event recording after the event. We also invite you to stay connected with CLC through our monthly newsletters, which you can sign up for on our website, download some of our reports. And we're going to be hosting the next Canadian Circular Economy Summit in April of next year in Montreal, April 15th to 17th, where we will have a very specific focus on construction, circularity, real estate, and the built environment. So thank you again. Dwayne, if you're still there and want to say a quick goodbye as we wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm impressed to see so many people on. A few years ago, we wouldn't have found this number of stakeholders. There just wasn't the knowledge. So really excited, and thank you to the panelists so much for today.
Wonderful. Take care, everyone.